Russia is on the brink of recession. That's the startling message that Russia's Minister for Economic Development, Maxim Reshetnikov, delivered toward the end of June. Reshetnikov's words carry a veiled plea to Russian President Vladimir Putin. End the Ukraine war now, or Russia will suffer even more. Things are so bad that Russia's central bank is reportedly urging Putin to pull out of Ukraine. The question now is whether Putin will listen, or if he's so far removed from reality that nothing his people say can influence his decisions. Reshetnikov's warning came during Russia's annual St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. He offered plenty of reasoning to support his grim forecast. The numbers indicate cooling, but all our numbers are a rearview mirror, Reshetnikov told attendees. Judging by the way businesses currently feel and the indicators, we are already, it seems to me, on the brink of going into a recession. And he's not the only one delivering these warnings. Also present at the forum was Russia's central bank governor, Elvira Nabiullina, who pointed out that the country's economic troubles stem from depleting resources. We grew for 2 years at a fairly high pace because unused resources were activated. We need to understand that many of those resources have truly been exhausted, she said. Nabiullina isn't just referring to material resources. She's also implying that Russia is facing a labor shortage. Human resources are dwindling as Putin continues sending more and more of the population to Ukraine. She has a point. In May, Russia's unemployment rate hit a new low of 2.2%. While that may sound like good news, fewer unemployed people implies more are earning a wage. It actually hides a deeper issue caused by Putin's war. There aren't enough people left to fill the jobs being offered in Russia's consumer-focused industries. The situation has deteriorated to the point that, as the Kiev Post reported on June 23rd, Russia is now forced to recruit thousands of foreign workers from China, Turkey, and India to overcome its labor shortages. In 2024 alone, 47,000 foreign workers arrived in Russia, highlighting how the country is struggling to fill vacancies due to a lack of labor. The message is clear. Russia faces a bleak 2026 unless Putin ends the war in Ukraine and focuses on fixing the domestic economy. At least the message seemed clear. In the aftermath of the St. Petersburg Forum, contradictory signals began emerging from Russia, as Putin appears desperate to control the narrative, and he's leading the contradiction himself. On June 21st, the Kiev Independent reported on Putin's remarks at the forum when questioned about the economist's grim forecasts. Quoting American author Mark Twain, Putin replied, "Rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated," referring to Russia's economy. His comments starkly contrasted with those of his financial experts. As they issued warnings about a troubled future, Putin dismissed their concerns. "Our most important task is to ensure the economy's transition to a balanced growth trajectory," Putin said. At the same time, some specialists and experts point to the risks of stagnation and even recession. This should not be allowed under any circumstances. But what exactly does Putin mean? That a recession shouldn't be allowed to happen, or that experts shouldn't be allowed to speak about it? Vasily Astrov, an expert on Russia's economy, shared his thoughts with Newsweek about these mixed messages. According to Astrov, economic policy remains one of the few areas in Russia where some freedom of debate still exists. That's why we're seeing contradicting views. However, he also cautions that any statement about the economy is usually shaped by the speaker's personal or institutional affiliations. There is still quite a lot of freedom in Russia when it comes to economic policy debates, the state of the economy, unlike in Erdogan's Turkey, for example, Astrov told Newsweek. So it is not surprising that there are different opinions expressed by various officials. What we seem to have here is a perfect example of Putin's denial. Surrounding him are all warning Putin that his war is sending Russia hurtling toward an economic wasteland. Rather than listening to them, Putin is sticking his fingers in his ears, ignoring the warnings, and claiming that Russia's economy is still on a strong footing, and he has plenty of so-called evidence to back that opinion. In April 2025, Russia raised its economic growth figure for 2024 to 4.3%, up from its previous 4.1%. That might be enough for Putin to assume his country's economy is doing well. After all, growth is good. On the surface, the 4.3% figure seems to showcase an economy that is heading in the right direction, driven by Putin's war. So why should Russia's leader listen to all of the naysayers? If the current policies worked in 2024, they will work in 2025, he seems to believe. What Putin is ignoring, willfully or otherwise, is that Russia's strong 2024 economic growth is an illusion. Driven by the military-industrial complex Putin has created since invading Ukraine, That growth draws a curtain over a myriad of economic problems the war has caused. Now the curtain is being pushed back and we're starting to see the many cracks in the foundation of Putin's economic policy that are leading Russia toward ruin. Russia's financial problems run deep, and they're all caused by the war Putin started in February 2022. The first sign of economic stress that Putin is trying to ignore comes from Russia's National Wealth Fund, funded primarily by income from gas and oil sales along with other key Russian investments. That fund is essentially a collection of liquid assets Russia can access quickly whenever needed. Think of the fund as a buffer. During times of economic instability such as those caused by the Ukraine war, Russia can use this fund to cushion its federal budget, according to Trading Economics. Putin's problem is that the National Wealth Fund is starting to run dry. On June 4th, the Kyiv Insider reported that Putin once again relied too heavily on the ever-depleting assets in that fund. He spent $4 billion of the fund on his war effort, leaving a paltry $36.1 billion. This spending included the sale of 29 tons of gold the fund held, leaving just 139 tons in its stockpile. Putin also sold off 11 billion Chinese yuan, meaning the fund now has only 153 billion yuan remaining. For context, the National Wealth Fund contained around $140 billion when Putin started the Ukraine war. This latest expenditure means Putin has burned through a little over $100 billion of the liquid reserves Russia had available. Keep in mind, those reserves are supposed to be replenished by Russia's oil and gas sales, as well as its investments. In other words, money has been coming into the fund even as Putin spends, so the real figure burned is likely even higher than $100 billion. United 24 Media points out that Russia has been using its National Wealth Fund to offset its budget deficit ever since Putin invaded Ukraine. As of July 3rd, the fund has been depleted by 68%, and there are no signs that Putin plans to stop spending anytime soon. It gets worse. Another issue with the National Wealth Fund as it stands now is its composition. Velocity highlights this in a YouTube video covering Russia's deepening financial crisis, stating, "An even more troubling story for Moscow, the National Wealth Fund has shifted from 45% US dollars and euros in 2021 to 60% Chinese yuan and 20% gold today. That's a problem for several reasons. First, it shows that Russia is increasingly reliant on Chinese currency to prop up its National Wealth Fund, demonstrating just how isolated it has become from the West. Dollars and euros are now almost worthless to Russia, thanks to the crushing weight of Western sanctions. Second, as Velocity points out, gold and yuan are less liquid than the currencies that once made up the fund. They can still be converted into rubles, but the systems for doing so are slower than those for the US dollar in particular. This means Russia must wait longer to access cash. Or as the Kyiv Insider puts it, the visual trajectory of the NWF, or National Wealth Fund, confirms the broader trend. As ruble-denominated non-liquid assets rise, dollar-based liquidity collapses. What remains is a reserve fund in name only, one whose solvency depends not on market value, but on the state's willingness to keep revaluing failed assets at par. So Russia's liquid reserves are running dry. That alone might not be a recession-causing problem. However, this depletion is accompanied by several other economic factors that are plaguing Russia, including the country's rampant military spending. War against Ukraine doesn't come cheap. The head of Ukraine's military intelligence, Kyrylo Budanov, made that clear in February when he claimed that Russia was spending about $1 billion per day on its invasion. This is an extremely expensive war. A day of war costs slightly less than $1 billion for them. This is a huge amount of money, Budanov said. 41% is the defense budget. These are abnormal figures. To implement this budget, almost all social programs, medical, educational, were curtailed. Already that's bad news for Russia's people. Budanov is pointing out that Putin is so hell-bent on completing his invasion that he's sacrificing the very services meant to take care of his population. And still, he keeps on spending. In September 2024, Al Jazeera reported that Russia will hike its defense spending by 25% in 2025. Raising total military expenditures to $145 billion for the year. That means defense accounts for 32% of its budget. This figure contradicts Budanov's, though it's worth noting that the 25% hike was announced by Russia itself. Possibly the amount Putin is willing to admit to spending. Budanov seems to be suggesting that the real number is much higher. Around the same time Budanov made his comments, Politico reported that Russia's military expenditure had risen so fast that it's now outspending all European countries. Collectively, Europe spent $457 billion on defense in 2024. At face value, that would place Russia behind. However, when Russia's military spending is calculated using purchasing power parity, which accounts for what a country actually receives for its money, the picture changes. Russia generally pays less for the same type of equipment than European nations. When adjusted for purchasing power parity, Russia's defense budget actually amounts to $461.6 billion, according to Politico. Either way, it's clear that Putin is pouring too much money into the military, contributing to his country's deepening economic problems. And Russia's leader, at the very least, seems capable of recognizing that fact. On June 27, just days after Russian economic experts delivered their warning, Putin announced plans to cut defense spending next year and the year after, over the next 3-year period. He tried to frame this move as evidence that Russia isn't preparing for further aggression in Europe, instead pointing fingers at NATO-aligned countries' rising military budgets as the real cause of instability. In reality, this decision is an admission that his experts are probably right. Still, it's a half measure, one that won't go nearly far enough to fix Russia's economic woes. Another factor fueling calls for an end to the Ukraine war is Russia's dire inflation and interest rate situation. On June 6, Russia's central bank announced a 100-point drop in the base interest rate. Normally, that would be good news, except the rate was 21% at the time. Now it's 20%, still sky high. This elevated rate makes it much harder for Russian citizens to borrow money, fund investments, or build businesses. Worsening the issue is Russia's persistent inflation. Prices have risen steadily over the past year. In February 2025, inflation hit a 2-year high, jumping to 10.1% year-on-year. It climbed to 10.3% in March and remained high at 10.2% in April. Inflation finally dropped just below 10% in May, settling at 9.9%. So, the Russian people aren't just struggling with limited access to credit, they're also paying more for nearly everything. Massive inflation is impacting everything from food to energy, leading to a noticeable decline in the average Russian standard of living. And once again, Putin's war is the primary cause. His obsession with the military-industrial complex, combined with Western sanctions, has created a perfect storm of inflation and interest rate chaos. Somehow, the situation gets even worse. There's also Russia's budget deficit to consider. On June 10th, AA reported that Russia had posted a 3.4 trillion ruble budget deficit for the first 5 months of 2025. That amounts to about $43.2 billion, and it's pretty significant. This is happening even as Russia's budget revenues rose by 3.1% during the 5-month period. The problem, once again, comes down to Putin's spending. Despite bringing in more money compared to the first 5 months of 2024, Russia is also spending a lot more. Budget expenditures climbed by 20.7% during the same period, meaning Russia's budget deficit now amounts to 1.5% of the country's entire gross domestic product. Why is this a bad thing? A budget deficit occurs whenever a country's expenses exceed the revenue it's generating. In other words, Russia is spending more than it has, and it's likely placing itself deeper and deeper into the pockets of its creditors to do so. There are 2 solutions to a budget deficit: either increase revenue-generating activity, which is difficult given the sanctions placed on Russia, or cut back on expenditures. Russia has already been doing plenty of the latter, as Budanov explained when discussing how much Putin spends on the Ukraine war. Putin himself has suggested that he'll be making cuts to Russia's defense budget. Budget deficits also create problems with interest rates, often pushing them higher, and can lead to increased national borrowing as well as reduced investment in that country. Russia is stuck in a painful cycle. Putin's war caused the budget deficit, and the litany of other problems resulting from that war makes it practically impossible for Russia to claw its way back out, at least not until the war ends. That brings us right back to Russia's economists and their calls for Putin to end the Ukraine war. They recognize what Putin is trying to hide. Russia is in an extremely weak position right now. As Velocity explains, Russian business leaders who remained in the country are complaining about economic mismanagement and growing stagnation. Russia's pivot toward China and the global south hasn't provided the economic lifeline Putin promised. Attempts to circumvent Western sanctions, which have played a key role in causing these economic issues, are no longer working. Russia built a shadow fleet and increased trade with China, both of which served as a temporary band-aid over the gaping economic wound caused by Western sanctions. These workarounds demonstrate how sanctions have forced Russia into less efficient and more costly trade agreements, Velocity adds. Russia is caught in a loop. The West isn't going to ease up anytime soon. The European Union is currently pushing for an 18th sanctions package, which has only been delayed because Hungary and Slovakia objected. As soon as that package passes, more pressure will be heaped on Russia. The only way to drive revenue into Russia is through the shadow fleet and trade with China, both of which are becoming progressively less effective while leaving Russia increasingly beholden to Beijing. And all the while, the Russian economy crumbles around Putin. That's why so many financial experts in Russia are calling for an end to the Ukraine war. The question now is simple. Will that end come? It's not looking good for Russia's economists. On July 3rd, Al Jazeera reported on a recent phone call between Putin and United States President Donald Trump. The Trump administration's goal was to use this call to restart ceasefire negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. It failed. Putin reiterated that he won't end the war unless the root causes of the Ukraine crisis are resolved. That root cause is Putin's belief that Ukraine shouldn't exist as a sovereign nation, that it should instead be a Russian vassal state. Nothing less than complete capitulation will satisfy him. Trump expressed frustration after the call. Al Jazeera reported that he said he was not happy and that the call made no progress toward moving Putin closer to a ceasefire. The Trump administration may finally be realizing that the entire Ukraine war comes down to one man and his unshakable opinion about what Ukraine is supposed to be. And that's the problem Russia faces right now. Putin's authoritarianism has taken him this far with little resistance from his people. But now, the Ukraine war is threatening to ruin Russia's economy. It's already come close. What started as a 5-day special military operation has evolved into a multi-year war of attrition that's draining Russia's resources. Putin has spent far more than he ever intended on this war, but his ideology remains unchanged. He doesn't want to see the war end based on how it stands right now. Whether through negotiation or direct action, he wants to destroy Ukraine's sovereignty. Ukraine will never agree to that, leaving continued fighting as Putin's only option. It doesn't matter if Russia's central bank is begging Putin to end the war. It also doesn't matter how deep into the doldrums Putin drags his country's economy. He has a goal. He won't be deterred from that goal. If nothing can change his mind, Putin is going to lead Russia into the abyss of economic destruction sooner rather than later. And all of this is happening as Putin launched a summer offensive that is far less successful than he hoped it would be. Even more money is being burned as that offensive collapses, causing Russia's momentum to slip at the worst possible time. Find out more in my next video, which uncovers the truth behind Russia's summer offensive. And remember to subscribe to Kinglaty channel for more commentary on the crumbling state of Russia's economy.